And then everyone can choose their own view, whether they want to enlarge that to their own screen or keep it however they want. So perfect, great. I'm going to mute myself and let you go and let you do this.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to talking about this. I've had an interest in railroads since I was 11 years old, and my father pinned a name tag on me in Old Town, Maine, and put me on the train by myself, and my grandparents picked me up at Union Station in Portland. So ever since then, I've been sort of fascinated by railroads. I show this slide up front because this is a picture of the Waterville, Wiscasset and Farmington Museum Railroad up in Alna, which is near Wiscasset. And I do this for significant reasons. First, it shows that number 9 engine, which is the last 2-footer that was built by the Portland company. So that's significant. It shows you a picture of a car barn, which is basically the repair facility for railroads. And if you look to the right, you'll see this little green type engine. That's called a yard goat. And that's basically just a small engine that can hook on to one car at a time and move it around the yard to be serviced or maintained. We're going to be talking today a little bit about the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railroad, which goes from Portland to Montreal, which later became the Grand Trunk. We're going to talk about the Boston and Maine Railroad, which is Boston to Portland, and the people in South Berwick would definitely have more of an interest in that one. Then we're going to talk about the Maine Central Railroad, which went basically from Bangor north and east towards Canada. And then we'll talk about that started when the Kennebec and Portland and the Androscoggin Railroads merged in 1862. And that's the one now where if you look at the cars going by, you'll see Pan Am on the side, or sometimes the old Guilford Railroad, which was the name before they changed it to Pan Am. So they run that one, the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central now. Now, CSX Consolidated Freight out of Florida is trying to buy the Pan Am Railroad, which is the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central, as you would remember it. And that was disapproved by the federal board. They're going to look at it again in April. They've resubmitted with some more data. And basically, the CSX is a Class 1 railroad, which means it's the big ones. And the ones in Maine now are Class 3 railroads, which are smaller ones. So they're having some questions in Western Massachusetts about competition. So they've got to work those out to find out, to make sure that if the federal government approves the purchase, that they don't squeeze out a small railroad or cause problems that are unintended. Well, we'll talk about the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, which is went from Searsport to Bangor and then all the way up north in Aroostook County. And that's kind of significant when we talk about the 3 deep ports that we have in Maine, because Maine is a huge shipping port. So that became, the Bangor and Aroostook became the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic, which we talk about in the book. Since the book was written, you remember all history is outdated the minute it's written. So to update that, in June of 2020, that railroad was purchased by the Canadian Pacific Railroad. That's huge, because that railroad goes all the way across Canada and goes down into the industrial states of Michigan and New York. So that's a Class 1 railroad. And why that's significant is if you have smaller railroads and you want to get something to a place in the far away, you have to transload it from one railroad to the other railroad to the other railroad, or unhook the cars. And there's a fee and a cost to all that handling, plus it slows it down. If you can hook onto a rail car in Aroostook County at a potato farm, and you can take it all the way to British Columbia without changing trains, that's a big deal. So that's been purchased by the Canadian Pacific. And since that's happened in the last 6 months, the amount of goods shipped out of Maine in that direction towards Canada and across Canada has increased by 40%. So that's a significant boon. Now we want to talk about Maine geography a little bit. Prior to the 1800s, we had very few roads in Maine. We were an agrarian society. And we had major ports out of Portland, Searsport, and Eastport. Almost everything come out of those ports. You had to find a way to get whatever you wanted to come in, or whatever you wanted to go out to one of those deep ports. So that was significant. And we'll talk about that in some detail, and we'll talk about some people who influenced that in great detail. So when we talk about the railroads, and these is not about trains and engines specifically, although I talk about a couple, this is basically the railroads, the business of the railroads, the social and economic connection to railroads and our industry in Maine. So why were they built? Who will benefit? We're going to talk about who benefits from these railroads, because people aren't going to do anything if there's no benefit for them. So we have to find, and that's been a problem along the way that had to be resolved several times in our history. And you look at it from the point of what's in it for me. So when I start talking about some of the key players, it's important to know that they're looking at it from their financial perspective. What are they going to get out of this? But as I used to say in my logistics war planning world, getting the right stuff to the right place at the right time for the right price is significant. For example, not anything to do with the book, but during the first Gulf War, they handed me a bunch of money and I went out to Ohio and Michigan. It was my job to get tanks being built to the East Coast to get on ships to send over to the Gulf. Well, the railroad beds weren't kept up, so we could go partly by rail. Then we had to put them on barges, go down the Mississippi, cross the Gulf of Mexico, through the canal in Florida, to the Atlantic Ocean, up to the East Coast. So if you're wondering why the Iraq was attacked in August and we didn't start the war in January, that's part of it. We had to get the right stuff there at the time. So that's how railroads can be really super important. And we'll talk about that a little bit when it relates to the Civil War and why that was important. So who benefits? Well, we got some key players. We're going to talk about two governors. The first one is Joshua Chamberlain, and he was kind of significant because he fought a significant battle that kept the rail lines open for the products going south for the war. Over 62% of it was going through one particular place, and he defended that. And he also was beneficial because after he left government, so he went to be governor, he found out that one of the problems we had with the railroads was they weren't allowed to have any public bonds to build railroads. If some company wanted to build roads, for example, Katahdin Iron Ore Factory out of Milo, if they want to get their goods somewhere, they have to build their own railroad to connect with another railroad to get it to the ports to ship that iron ore out. They weren't allowed to borrow money through public bonds. And Governor Chamberlain, when he became governor, got it passed through the legislature so that they could have government bonds. So that's kind of significant. And then later, most recently, we had another governor named John Baldacci, who is a lifelong friend of mine, so I have to put that caveat in there. And he was very significant because they were about to tear up a lot of rail tracks in Aroostook County. And he got they weren't being maintained, so they just said, we're not going to stop running rail there. Well, that would have devastated shipping stuff north from Bangor north. It just would have devastated it. So we would have lost a lot of businesses, would have gone out of business, like your farmers in Aroostook County and your paper mills up there would have a hard time shipping their final products by rail. He also was key significance in the ports, the three ports, the Eastport, Searsport, and Portland. He bought the new crane system in Portland, and that now they're shipping an enormous amount of product out of there. He also got the funding to rebuild that rail I was talking about in Aroostook County by working with Senator Olympia Snowe, who's on the Senate Finance Committee. And Baldacci was, before he was governor, he was in Congress. He was on the Transportation Committee and the Railroad Subcommittee. So Amtrak comes through Maine now because of John Baldacci's efforts. So he did a lot of things for the ports and for the railroads themselves. We're going to talk some other key players too. We're going to talk about some mill owners. Remember I said, what's in it for me? Well, the mill owners, you had the Bates Mills and the Libby Mills in Lewiston. Now, these were textile mills, and the Bates Mill was built after the mills, copied after the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. But what's significant about these owners that I'm going to talk about, the Bates and Libby in Lewiston and the John Graham in Bangor, they owned electric companies. And that's going to be very significant when we get to talk about trolleys. So we'll talk about how the Bates Mills were significant. We'll talk about how the John Graham and with the General Electric in Bangor was significant. And he also owned Androscoggin Electric, which is a power company again. We'll talk about two-footers, the smaller railroads and why they were significant and what impact they had, and how a man named John Mansfield happened to see those in Wales when he was visiting over there and decided they could be adapted in the United States and used because they were more affordable to build. And then we'll obviously talk about John Poor, who was out of Portland. He owns the Portland Company later, which was a foundry that built railroads and engines and even military equipment at one point. But he also was a significant factor in getting the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railroad built from Portland, Maine to Montreal, Quebec. And that was a significant, that opened the Quebec products going in and out of Montreal through the state of Maine. And we also want to look at, when we think about the trolleys later on, we talk about trolleys, think about suburbia. If you lived in a triple decker in Portland, Maine, and only 20% of the people had power in their houses, it was kind of hot in summer. So they could take trolleys and go to Riverton Park. They could go to Wildwood Park in Cumberland. They could go to Merrimeeton Park in Brunswick. They could go to Orchard because they could get on the trolleys and travel down those to get out of town for the day and enjoy it and take a respite from the heat. So we're going to talk about those things. Now, when I ask people where the first railroad was in Maine, they almost always talk about the Bangor and Piscataquis Railroad that went from Bangor to Old Town and eventually to Milford, which is my old neck of the woods. Well, that's true if you talk about passenger trains. But the first train that was built in Maine, first railroad built in Maine, was the Calais and Bering Railroad down near Calais and Bering in that area of eastern Maine. That was built by a man named William Vance. Now, the town of Vanceboro is named after him, and the town of Charlotte, Maine is named after his daughter. That is now the New Brunswick and Maine Railroad, and it goes connects with the Canadian railroads, and it also go all the way to Mattawamkeag, Maine, where there's a large terminal that they can transload, do other things. So this is what it looked like. It was pulled by horses. They didn't even have an engine. He had to find a way to get all these lumber mills that he owned. And this was the key to a lot of the railroads, where these people had lumber mills and they had to find out how to get the pulp to the lumber mills and the lumber to the ports to ship out. So he had these lumber mills up the St. Croix River, up in Bering, and all the way up to Vanceboro. And he had to find a way to get those to Calais to get on the ships. And Calais is the deepest water port, the highest tide in the United States, 35-foot tides at some times. So that during high tide, you can ship some pretty heavy things out of there. He had to find a way to get the lumber from his mills, and he owned about 20 mills up and down that St. Croix River area, some on the New Brunswick side and some on the Maine side. But this is what it looked like. Now, this is not a picture of that railroad, but this is a picture of a similar railroad, and you can see it was pulled by horses. Later on, obviously, they had an engine. The other thing that's wrong in this picture, for what I'm talking about, you see the rails in this picture are steel. The rails on the original rails on the Calais and Bering Railroad were made out of wood. So they basically had to find a way to basically skid the lumber being produced from the mills down to Calais to put on ships to ship out. So that was the first railroad. Now, the Bangor-Piscataquis Railroad was from Bangor through Orono and Vesey to Old Town and eventually across to Milford. And that was the first passenger railroad in Maine. Now, when you think of railroads, don't think of railroads like we think of today. These were converted stagecoaches that they put on train wheels and put on the tracks. It's kind of significant for several reasons. First, they weren't heated. So they would preheat each one of these little cabs that could hold 4 people. They would put 2 10-gallon cans of hot water in each coach. And before they departed, just before they departed, they put 2 more 10-gallon cans of hot water. So hopefully that would keep them warm enough in the winter so they wouldn't freeze to death going from Bangor to Old Town or to Milford. Now, what's significant about that is the ticket master went coach to coach outside, reaching through the coach and collected the money. The other significant part of it is they only had one speed, 12 miles an hour. There wasn't any reducing speed and speeding up. You went 12 miles an hour. They also had open cabs in the train. So they didn't have a cab on it. They just had the engine and basically rails on the side and the coal cars. So the engineer and the coal tender were out in the cold and the heat, whatever the elements were. They also couldn't see where the hell they were going. So they had a spotter that stood on top of the car, the first car behind the engine, And if he spotted anything, he pulled a rope that was hooked to a bell so they could know to stop the thing. And it took longer to stop then than it does to stop trains now. And that was only going 12 miles an hour. And it takes about a mile to stop a train now. So you can see the significance of that. This is a picture they wouldn't let me use in the book because they said it was too poor quality. But I thought it was kind of important because, again, when Governor Chamberlain got that law passed and got this railroad going, he called his old boss, President Grant, who was out of office at the time. This is in 1871. He came up to Bangor and actually they had a dedication of the railroad. And he rode the railroad from Bangor to Old Town. It wasn't across to Milford Neck. And he stopped along the way with all sorts of people cheering him. This is when he was running, this was when he was out of office, and he just went up to do that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the different type of railroads. The width of the track is significant. Well, you hear the word narrow gauge railroads. Now, narrow gauge railroads were less than 2 feet apart. So you hear them often called two-footers. And there's a great book that's 2 Foot to Togus. It's talking about the Kennebec Railroad that was written by, I can't remember, I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, 2 Feet to Togus is an excellent book to pick up to read about two-footers. But the narrow gauge tracks, if you built narrower tracks, you could build smaller engines, you had less right-of-way you had to use, you had less construction, the bridges were smaller. Moreover, they built these going up the mountains to get to the timber and the logging. And I mentioned that Katahdin Iron Works up in Milo. They had to get that ore from there down to Bangor, and in order to do that, they had to do it by rail. Well, the smaller engines could climb easier than the bigger engines. Of course, they couldn't pull as much, haul as much. So basically, if you look at it now like commuter trucking service, that was basically what it was. They were smaller, specific purpose, go to point A to point B to get to the hook up with other railroads or to ports so they could ship their stuff out. So what did we ship out of there on the narrow gauges? We shipped lime, we shipped ice, we shipped lumber and timber, we shipped iron ore. All these things were shipped out of Maine, and you had to get them there. So they used the narrow gauge tracks. Now the narrow gauge museum in Portland, it has a little tourist train that runs along India Street, runs along the ocean that you can take. That's kind of a fun ride. They also have the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes that you can go visit. That's a neat one. And we're going to talk about that particular railroad a little while later. And my favorite is the Waterville, Wiscasset, and Farmington Railroad up in Wiscasset, or in Alden next to Wiscasset. And because they have an operating tourist train that you can take an excursion, it's a great outing. Now the wider gauge, the standard gauge, is 4 foot 8 inches. And that's what the railroads that you see go up and down, the Boston and Maine, the Maine Central, the Pan Am, all those today will ride on the standard gauge tracks. So these smaller narrow gauge railroads had to go to hook up with the bigger railroads so that they could haul them across the United States. We had different types of locomotives as well. We had the steam engine, which I'm sure you're all aware of. That steam engine that I'm showing here, the 470, or the 410 rather, is on display in Lowell, Massachusetts, downtown Lowell, Massachusetts, and we took that photo from there. But that's an example of a Boston and Maine steam engine. The one in the middle, eventually they came onto diesel engines, and showed a picture of the Amtrak to show you the diesel. But after about 1963 or 64, everything converted to diesel. And then, of course, we had the electric trolleys or the electric railroads. And this is a photo of the railroad down at the Seashore Trolley Museum in Ogunquit or Wells, depending on which website you go to look at. But that's also a great place to visit. Now, the Boston and Maine Railroad was a Class 1 railroad. Now, what's a Class 1 railroad? We're using today's standards, and you can translate that to smaller numbers years past, but it equates to that. A Class 1 railroad is one that has revenues of more than $450-something million. A Class 2 railroad is something that has less than that, but above 35 million. And a Class 3, the real short railroads, are less than 35 million. So that's significant because there were different rules for those. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Pan Am and the struggles they had and how they tried to in my mind, undermine the workers and pay them a lot less money by getting reclassed so they didn't have to meet the rules of the higher railroads. Now, the Boston and Maine Railroad, they didn't build anything. They bought smaller railroads, put them together, and made a railroad, and they called it the Boston and Maine Railroad. There were 4 different divisions. You had the Portland Division, the Fitchburg Division, New Hampshire Division, and the Connecticut line that all hooked up. So when you think of the Boston and Maine, it was gobbled up all these other smaller railroads. This is where they went. You can see that as far as we're concerned, they came over from Dover through your area and came up and went through, headed left to Rochester or headed up towards Portland. So that's what they did. So the Boston and Maine, basically, for the purposes of the Maine railroads, went from Boston to Portland. That's basically what they did. So they came into Maine, went straight up. This is one of the famous photos of the Flying Yankee. And the Flying Yankee was, hold on, I lost my note. The Flying Yankee was kind of significant. That was a tourist train. And you can still see that at one of the museums. That's a diesel electric railroad steamliner built in 1935 for the Boston and Maine Central Railroads. 3rd steamliner service after the Union Pacific, and another one in Chicago. Portland to Boston and then returning to Portland. It operated 6 days a week, didn't operate on Sundays. Now what's kind of neat is a trivia side thing. It didn't have a dining car, that railroad. The meals were served on trays which hooked on the back of the seats. Guess what came out of that? How they serve airline meals. So that was how they came up with that idea. The engine can now be reviewed at the Hobo Museum in Lincoln, New Hampshire. So that's a very famous engine. Now let's talk about the Grand Trunk Railroad. Now the Grand Trunk Railroad, which started as the Maine, Montreal, and Quebec Railroad, this is a picture of the terminal in Portland, Maine. So if you go to Portland, Maine now, down on the water, you go down Indian Street, on the corner of Indian Street, you'll see a building there. It's now the Gorham Savings Bank. If you look up over the door, it says Grand Trunk Railroad and Steamship Company. So that's kind of significant, but think about the cruise ships that come into Portland now. The cruise ships of the time, the Cunard lines, the predecessor to the Cunard lines, and the White Dominion lines came into Portland. They walked up the street to their terminal, their station, which was more beautiful than Union Station in my view. And they got on the train and they could go all the way to Montreal. But that started, and we'll talk about how that Portland was the closest ice-free port. Why did Canada want to even ship stuff here? They built canals in Quebec to get products to the port of Montreal. They were shipping out of there through the St. Lawrence Seaway. Well, the St. Lawrence Seaway froze up in the winter. So they were seasonal as far as what they could ship. So they were looking for a way to get the products or keep going year round. So they were looking at ports. Well, Boston was in the hunt for being the host base to build a railroad from there to go to Quebec. Well, this guy I talked about earlier named John Poor out of Portland raced the people from Boston up to Montreal and was there and presented. He was the only one that had in his hand a charter signed by the Maine legislature saying you could have a railroad. Massachusetts hadn't have that yet. He also proved that we were hours closer, more quicker to ship into Portland to Montreal than it was from Boston. And he showed information where Boston Harbor flows over quite often, about 8 or 10 times a year, and Portland only flows over like 3 days in the past 10 years. But he also, to prove that he could get up there more quickly, a team followed him, and they went by horseback and to get up there, to race up from Portland to Montreal to do that. And they made it in time, but a few people tried to catch up with him, including a man named Preble, who's a big name around Portland. And he had that charter in his hand, but he also had a bunch of mail that came from England. And 6 hours, he could prove that in 6 hours, if you did it by train, that mail could be there, and it'd take like 10 hours to come from Boston. So they had a huge, they're just tearing down some of the grain elevators grain elevators now in Portland, but they had a bunch of stuff going in and out of Portland, passengers and freight. So that was very significant. Here's what that Grand Trunk looked like. As you can see, it went from Portland and it went all the way up and it hung a left. And it went up to Bethel and then it went over through New Hampshire and into Montreal. So that became the Grand Trunk. And that's going to be significant a little later when I talk about the Grand Trunk specifically. The Grand Trunk started as the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railway that I talked about. It went from Portland, Maine to Yarmouth. Then it went to Danville Junction, and that's in Auburn. And if you go up Route 100 into Auburn, where it hooks up with the interstate, hang a right, it's right there, and that was significant. And John Poor was the one who went up there and raced to do it. He was competing with them, and he's the one that started the Portland Company. And what's kind of neat about the Grand Trunk Railroad is, keep in mind these mill owners. You had the Bates Mills and the Libby's Mill in Lewiston, and the population was growing because they needed workers for the mill, but it wasn't growing fast enough. So they said, we need some workers. So they sent some recruiters to Quebec, and Quebec was having a hard time. It was kind of poor. They were going through like a mini depression or whatever. So they sent recruiters up there and say, you know, if you get on the train and you come down to Lewiston and Auburn to work in our mills, you can come down, work for the week and go back home, come down and work for 2 or 3 weeks and come back home. Well, a lot of them came down and they stayed. So much so that the population in Lewiston in 10 years was 10 times greater, going from like 1,800 to 18,000 in 10 years. And if you go up there now, there's even a little town, part of the town that's called French Settlement, and that's still there. Well, also what's kind of neat, but you can actually see the Grand Trunk Passenger Museum in Lewiston. It still exists, and you can go up there and see what it looks like. What's kind of neat about that is 2 things. Number one, you had these people coming to work down here. So, but that was in order to do that, they had to streamline it. So these people had some money. They were the mill owners. So they contacted the state legislature and the federal government. The federal government worked with the Canadian government. And they said, you can go back and forth. No customs, no duties or anything. So that was the first international trade agreement between the United States and another country for industry. So it's kind of neat to see that. So many people came through that terminal in Auburn, in Lewiston, that they called that the Ellis Island of Maine, because the people came here and they stayed. So you can see that this one went up and hung a left. You look at the Maine Central Railroad, and that basically comes up to Portland, and it goes up and it hangs a right, heads up towards the down east area, and it goes up across to Vanceboro, which is significant later on. But it basically does that. It goes up there. There was a major intersection in Vanceboro. There's another one up in near Oakfield, Maine, in Oakland, Maine, rather. And Sherman Station. They had a big interchange there for railroads. But that again was to support the mills. So that's what they did. They went up and hung a right. We also had a thing called the Bar Harbor Express. Now, when I talked about the Boston and Maine coming to Portland, that was significant because people from New York were now taking the train to Portland, getting on a train, getting on the Maine Central, and going down to Bar Harbor for vacations. All the rich people that lived down in Bar Harbor, the Woolworths and the Vanderbilts, they had their homes down there. The men would go to work during the week or for a couple of weeks at a time when they wanted to come to visit their family in Maine in the summers. They'd take the Bar Harbor Express. I like to show this is at Union Station in Portland, and I like to show this because it shows the diesel engine and it shows the steam engine. The Bar Harbor Express was seasonal passengers, served the resorts area. It was a joint venture of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, the Maine Central Railroad, and the Boston and Maine Railroad. So that was a lot of tourist traffic came through there as a result of that. Now people could come to Maine on vacation. And so that was significant. Also, it's kind of neat when they showed you that picture of how the Maine Central went up, hung a right. If you went to Bath, Maine, there was no bridge there. The Carlton Bridge wasn't built till 1927. So how did they get that train across to the other side of the river to go up to the Portland cement factory and the lime factories up in the Rockland, Thomaston area, and to head up to the Calais area in that direction? They put them on a ferry and cross the river that way. And this is not a very good picture because I had to blow it up. And if you look closely, you can see that's a train engine on the ferry. They had a track right on there, and they just put them on there and went across, and they could take like one engine and 2 cars or 4 cars at a time, take them across, hook them up on the other side and go to their business and then come back in the other direction. So I think that's kind of neat to see how they had to find a workaround so they didn't have to go all the way up to Bangor and around. They could cross there and they didn't have to worry about that. The Bangor and Aroostook Railroad it was a joint venture that started as a merger between the Katahdin and Iron Works Railroad that I talked about coming out of Milo and up Brownsville Junction area, and the Bangor and Piscataquis Railroad that went from Bangor to Old Town to Milford. What's also significant is because it went down to Searsport, and that was a major port. It's still a major port. And you'll read in the book that more weapons and munitions were shipped out of Searsport in World War II for the war than any other port in the United States. It's also significant to me because I was stationed at Loring Air Force Base up in Limestone, and I was in charge of the railroad there. And I use that term loosely. When I had to find out what engines we used, I had to call and ask the people who used to work for me. But basically, the Bangor and Aroostook Road would go up, and we had a short line where they would deliver coal and they would deliver products that we needed to the Loring Air Force Base. However, when we had to haul munitions, specifically heavy weapons, bombs and things, we used our own railroad engines, went down to Searsport, picked it up, went up to the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, and then hooked up and went over to Limestone. So that's kind of significant. And even now, after the Loring closed, Senator Collins was able to get money to open up a mill or factory up there to build a Humvee type and other Army track equipment there. They put those on the trains, and until just a few years ago, they'd build them up there. They'd send them to Searsport and unload and take them up there for repairs or to make them armor them. So they still went back and forth. So that's still significant railroad from that perspective. They transported most of the agricultural and lumber products at first, and later potatoes, and they also had a bus service. I remember when I was looking for what college to go to, I got on a Bangor and Aroostook bus in Old Town and went up to Halton to look at Ricker College and went to Presque Isle to look at the University of Maine at Presque Isle at the time. But I took the bus up and the bus back. But this is where Baldacci came into play. And again, they wanted to tear up these tracks. If they tore up the tracks, like I said before, they'd have a hard time getting all the products to the paper mills, from the paper mills, getting the logs to them and getting the wood chips and the paper products out of there. So he was able to, like I said, buy all that railroad track and to have the thing to maintain it. And he worked out a deal with the Irving people from Canada that own most of the timberland in Maine to run the railroad for a short period of time. So he also wanted to get by. The railroads north of Bangor aren't built to the same standards. The interstate isn't built to the same weight standards as south of Bangor. So the trucks that were really beating up the roads. So he said, we got to try to get some of those trucks off the roads and put more of them on rails. So they use the containers and they use the, move stuff by rail. And if you can move 400 miles on a gallon of diesel engine by rail, and you can only go 100 miles with that same gallon of diesel on a truck. So it also was significant in saving the environment. The problem was they didn't go exactly where you needed to. You had to take from wherever the potatoes were and take them by truck over to the train and get them on there. So it took quite a process to do that. And years ago, they had all the trains would come right in the back of the factories and they'd load it up. Later on, when they got to trucking, they abandoned some of those, so they had to rebuild those. So, but he did a good job doing that. And he also, like I said, with the ports of Searsport and in especially Portland, he was instrumental in buying Portland terminal. And now if you look around, you see Imeskip containers on all these trains that are being transloaded. And that's a huge shipping company out of Iceland that has a whole bunch of ships, 20 or 30 ships. And there's about 300 containers a day that go through Portland, coming in and going out. You also will see, I saw one time when I was heading towards Rumford, and I said, where's it going? They said, Poland Springs, to pick up water. They picked up a whole container full of water to ship around the country and around the world. So I said, oh, they go up there empty? He said, oh, no, they're full of plastic pellets because they make the bottles up there too. So they don't go empty either way. So it's kind of neat how they use the rail and how they use the containers to do that. The Central Maine and Quebec Railroad is one that went from Bangor, basically. That's the one that went down to Searsport. That's the new name of it. Now, the Central Maine and Quebec is kind of significant because, I'm going to find it now. It was formerly that Maine, Montreal, and Atlantic Railroad that I talked about. As of June of 1920, that's the one that was bought by the Canadian Pacific Railroad. So you can see how they can hook up and get products all around the world by doing that. I want to talk a little bit about a kind of a neat little railroad that didn't go anywhere. It didn't hook up to anything. That's the Kennebec Central Railroad. And that's, it's Jones is the name of the author that wrote 2 Foot to Togus, because it was basically a 2-foot road, a narrow gauge railroad that was built specifically to connect the soldiers' home in Togus to Gardner, but it stopped on the Randolph side. Then you could go up some steps and get on a footbridge and go across to Gardner to the town and shop. But they were the same people that were associated with the Sandy River and Franklin and Mechanic railroads. The construction started. Now, what's kind of neat is it basically hauled coal. The coal came up on barges. They unloaded it, put it on the coal trains that went to the Togus from Randolph. And they also had passenger cars on there. So the soldiers could be taken over there. They could come back to the Gardner and Randolph area for R&R. And if you've ever been up to Togus, you can see where they used to have parades up, a field up there. They had a big gazebo up there so people would go there for the day trips for entertainment. So that's kind of neat too. They had those special services. Here's a picture of the Kennebec Central Railroad, and you can see it was a very small railroad. And that engine there actually came from the Sandy River and Ranger Lakes. When one of theirs died, that's where that engine came from. So that's kind of significant in that respect. Now let's talk a little bit about electric railroads, and this is significant to you folks where you are. This was the first trolley, the first sketch of a trolley that was built in Bangor, Maine. Now, more than 90 communities had trolleys in Maine, 90. The shortest one was in Paris, Maine, that went for 2 miles. The Portland Railroad system, which you care about down in your area, existed of the Saco Old Orchard line, 93 miles of track, serving the communities of Portland, South Portland, Cape Elizabeth, Scarborough, Saco, Old Orchard Beach, Westbrook, Gorham, and so on. It was a big railroad. Then you had the Portland and Brunswick Railroad that served the trolley parks that I talked about earlier, the casinos and the trolley parks. So those were kind of significant. Now, again, picture yourself in that triple decker wanting to get out of town for the day, or even better than that, picture yourself wanting to commute from one town to the other to go to work. You could now do that now. Rail car wasn't passenger cars weren't in vogue yet, so you couldn't get to point A from point B. You had to work in the same town that you lived in. Now you could get on a trolley, go to a neighboring town, work, and come home for the evening. The interurban trolleys that we had the Portland Lewis Interurban was the busiest and the most profitable. It was 40 miles long. Again, it was owned by an electrical company. They had all this electricity they were producing for the mills, and they said, how can we use this? Well, we can start electrifying homes and businesses, but we can also use it to power trolleys. That was only 40 miles long. It had limited stops, so it didn't stop in too many places, like 3 or 4 stops. And so that's the trolley that that we'll see. Excuse me, I had my shot today, so I'm having a little bit of side effects. But anyway, that was the one where we had Roosevelt come up, Teddy Roosevelt come up. And actually there was a picture that they wouldn't let me use. There was a poor quality when he stopped in Gray, Maine, and he's waving to the people out back. But you can see that particular photo in the Burns public television movie about the railroads. So that's kind of interesting. So that was the most common. So people could get on a trolley in Lewiston, go to Portland, work for the day, come back home in the evening and commute. So that helped develop suburbia. People started seeing they could work in a different town. The longest railroad or trolley was the Lewiston, Augusta, Waterville Street Railway, which is 142 miles long, slower, made a lot more stops, carried a longer distance. But somebody could still get on a trolley in Waterville and end up in Portland and come back the same day. They could spend 3 or 4 hours in Portland and come back the same day. So that was kind of neat. Now, I included a lot more information in the Atlantic Shoreline Railway because that's more significant to your neck of the woods. This happens to be the number 58 at the Seashore Trolley Museum as part of the Atlantic Shore Trolleys. That connected Cape Porpoise, Kennebunk, Port, Biddeford, Kennebunk, Alfred, Sanford, Springville, Wells, Ogunquit, York Beach, Kittery, Elliott, South Berwick. That station for that South Berwick trolley / train station still exists in South Berwick. I don't know if any of you guys know where it is, but I don't know what it's used for now, but the building is still there. It connected with Dover, New Hampshire through South Berwick and with the Portsmouth, New Hampshire via ferry. They had 4 miles of right-of-way between Townhouse Square and Biddeford to Log Road, so they could connect there. And that's been preserved by the Seashore Trolley Museum. It connected with the Boston and Maine Western Division at Kennebunkport Station, so you could take a trolley at one of these other towns and hook up with a railroad station and take the Boston and Maine to where you wanted to go. Riverton Park, I talked about if you wanted to get out for a day. Riverton Trolley Park is in Portland, was established in 1896. Again, these people owned an electric company. There was only 15 or 20% of the people that had electricities in their homes. So for 15 or 20 cents, they could get on a trolley and go out for the day and spend the time at a park that had electricity, had merry-go-rounds, had rides, had orchestras, had dances, all these things. They were served by a trolley that was departed from Monument Square. And they had a casino there, an amphitheater, a dance hall, they had a wildlife petting zoo. So that was where people went to get away for the day. This is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt on the Narcissus in Gray in August of 1914. And that's the one they wouldn't let me put in the book because of the quality. What's kind of significant about this is that's that Portland Lewiston interurban. And they named all the cars after flowers. So this Narcissus is kind of significant in our history because after it wasn't used anymore, somebody bought it and put it on the lake for a camp. And the Seashore Trolley Museum purchased it a few years ago. And they're restoring that. It's over $1 million project, but they're restoring that in its original condition because it's a significant part of our history with trolleys. So you can go up there and actually see that project being undergoing and how they're doing on it. That basically concludes the talk. Do you have any questions for me?
So Bill, if you make me host again, I can get into, I can unmute people for questions and chats.
Hey, let me see how I can do that.
So if you go up to my name and click the 3 little dots, you should be able to say make host or something like that. I'm trying to change my view so I can see the chat box better. Okay, and so now I'm host, good. And I guess it doesn't matter. Let me see. Okay, let's see. So in the chat box so far, it says an early image in your presentation showed horses pulling a load of lumber on a cart of some sort on the rails. Wouldn't have been more efficient for them to build a road and have the horses pull a wagon than build a railroad track for that purpose?
The answer is no. If you look at the topography from Calais, Maine up to Vanceboro to run along the river, they were taking the products across the frozen river in the wintertime, for example, on skidded things, and they would just hook it up to the back of the horses to get down there. They didn't have roads then. They didn't have good roads at that time. So it was more efficient for them just to build a small railroad to take it down there. Because at the time, we didn't have the trucks and the stuff to haul the freight that you would have if you'd want to put it on a flatbed truck to haul it. They didn't have those.
Right, that makes sense. If anyone else has any questions, please type it in the chat box because I can't seem to be able to see everyone's pictures right now. So do just put it in the chat box. Question was, could you talk a little bit about the mountain division of the Maine Central Railroad, history or anecdotes?
I go about a little bit of the book, but the mountain division, hold on, let me look at something here for a minute.
Chat box. Okay. We do.
The answer is no, but let me look it up. Hold on. That wasn't in the area that connected to Maine a whole lot, so I didn't go into that a whole lot, but let me look up, see what I've got in there.